Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob Cywes, the CarbAddictionDoc. And as a surgeon, especially as a pediatric surgeon, over the years I've treated a large number of children, of kids, of adolescents with ulcerative colitis. So today's topic is ulcerative colitis. Ulcerative colitis is one of the categories of what we call inflammatory bowel diseases. Basically, there is inflammation of the intestine, and there are certain characteristics that are required for the clinical diagnosis of ulcerative colitis. First of all, it is basically contained to the colon, to the large intestine. You may get what we call a little bit of backwash up the terminal ileum, up the lower part of the small intestine, but to all intents and purposes, it is the colon that is involved, not the small intestine, not the anus. The colon is involved, and it is an inflammatory condition, thick, inflamed mucosa that bleeds very readily, that can form strictures, but it doesn't go through the entire wall. It is just contained to the mucosa and the submucosa. It doesn't go beyond that. Like Crohn's disease, another one of the inflammatory bowel diseases, completely separate. It doesn't form granulomas, so that's another part of the biologic diagnosis. And you get all of these abscesses, this pus, forming in the crypts of your colon. So the colon is this wavy structure, and those are called crypts, and you get this pus forming in there, almost like zits on a teenager's face, where you get plugging of those hair follicles, and you get this pus forming, and it's a zit. You get exactly the same. So it's kind of a colon full of zits. Not funny, but it's incredibly painful. And what happens is you get stovepiping, you get this solidification of the wall of the outside of the colon, and these patients have a lot of diarrhea, particularly bloody diarrhea. They can be very anemic, a lot of cramping, a lot of severe pain, usually not rupture like you see in Crohn's, usually not a lot of strictures, but a lot of pain, a lot of bleeding. And especially in young growing children, that can affect growth. It can cause growth failure. You're pooping all the time. They don't feel like eating. A lot of malnutrition associated with. Remember, in humans, the colon only has really three purposes. Number one, to absorb or secrete salt. Number two is to absorb and secrete water. And number three is to concentrate the liquid that comes out of the small intestine into solid poop. That's really the goal of the colon. We're going to swing back to that as we look at treatment of ulcerative colitis. So who gets ulcerative colitis? We don't have as yet a specific gene, but we know that the disease runs in families. And so there must be a genetic association. I'm not willing to say causal, but a certain group of genes that are most likely associated with an increased risk of ulcerative colitis. And then there has to be an environmental trigger. And the most likely two candidates for environmental triggers are, number one, what we call the gut biome. The bacteria, the viruses, the funguses that live in the intestine. I'm going to come back to that. Or secondly, it might be the specific food that we eat. Now, ulcerative colitis is what's called an autoimmune disease. In other words, what's happening here is something, a bacteria or an antigen, a piece of food, or a product in the food is triggering our immune system to overreact. It's an overreaction. And that little trigger causes this massive reaction by the body against that antigen, an overreaction of the immune system. And then the immune system not only takes care of or tries to isolate or get rid of that particular initiating bug or antigen, it actually destroys its own tissue, trying to get rid of this antigen that it sees as foreign and very dangerous. So we have an autoimmune response. We have a ramped up immune response that is cross-reacting in an aggressive way to something it doesn't need to react to, at least with such venom, and a genetic predisposition for that immune system reacting in the way it does. Now, ulcerative colitis may also affect the liver, it may affect joints. There are some what we call extra-intestinal manifestations of the disease, may cause stomatitis, may cause other manifestations. Whether those are direct autoimmune responses or associative, we don't know. And then the other thing is, while the body is continuously damaging itself, it is also continuously healing itself. And as part of that healing damage process, sometimes with a much greater incidence, the cells of the colon go down a progressive pathway of dysfunction. And those mucosal cells start becoming deformed, the genetics, the genes start malfunctioning, and slowly over time, there is a much higher risk of colonic mucosal cancer, of colonic cancer in patients with ulcerative colitis. And by 10 to 15 years of what we call pancolitis, those are the patients who are at much, much higher risk of getting cancer. So we have to take that into account, the length of time you've had the disease, the age at which it started, and the severity of the persistent disease. If you have a flare of your ulcerative colitis and it's quiescent for a long time, your risk of cancer is much lower. If you only have a small piece of your intestine involved rather than the whole colon, there's a lower risk. And then the final thing about ulcerative colitis that is unique is that it always starts at the anus and then goes backward for a variable distance all the way to the end of the colon. And as far as we're aware, it does not involve the appendix or directly involve the lower small intestine, except by backwash of some of the contents. So there can be inflammation, but it's not primarily involved. It is involved as indirectly. So to read a little quote here of understanding this is that we believe that either a bacteria or virus or some food can mistakenly trigger the immune system to attack the inner lining of the large intestine, and this immune system response causes the inflammation, leading to symptoms. And certainly there's a genetic predisposition, but also an environmental predisposition. Now, the final piece of this puzzle is the inflammatory response itself. And the two things that ramp up the inflammatory response, at least in the intestine, and I know this is going to upset a lot of people, well, less so now than we did, but number one, sugar and starch, carbohydrates, especially grain-based carbohydrates. We know grains cause gluten, and grains have been implicated in ulcerative colitis. So definitely a factor. And then the second one is directly or indirectly fiber. Fiber, micro and macroscopic fiber. And the bacteria and the biome that comes along with fiber-containing products, be they grains or vegetables. So there's a genetic predisposition. The disease is exacerbated by chronic excessive carbohydrate consumption and insulin resistance, which ramps up global inflammation. Your inflammatory, your immune system is like, let's go, okay? It's like Arnold Schwarzenegger on steroids, just wants to rip everybody's heads off. But also, the triggering factors are going to be some antigen in plants. And this is not me just looking for witches behind every tree. That's a reality. And the second one is some of the bacteria, the biome that is associated primarily with a plant-based diet. We don't know the specifics, but those are the most likely culprits. Now, let's work backwards. Let's work backwards from this. How do we create quiescence? Well, the medical way to dumb down the system is to use the blunderbuss approach. You take this shotgun out and you just fire it into your body and say, let's suppress the immune system. And the classic are steroids. Steroids are very powerful anti-inflammatory drugs, but they destroy the immune system. Well, they dampen the immune system. And that affects everything where the immune system is actually doing good. So your prevalence of other diseases, of cancers, ramps up through the roof. And those cancers are also associated with a high carbohydrate diet, which affects the genetics of cancer. And there may be some cross-reaction there between carbohydrates triggering the cancer in ulcerative colitis patients, not just the turnover of tissue. So carbohydrates are a large component of this, but so is that immune system. So we dampen it down with steroids, and then we use selective and non-selective immunosuppressive drugs And they may be injectable, they may be consumed, they may work over a month, they may work over a week, they may be daily, but just to globally dampen down or selectively dampen down specific aspects of the immune system. That's not fixing the disease, that's fixing the response. That's taking care of your immune system, but it comes with dramatic side effects. Well, let's see if we can figure out what's activating the immune system, because that's going to be the triggering cause. And if we don't know exactly what it is, but we've refined this down to particular bacteria that are most closely associated with a plant-based human biome, and plants themselves or fiber itself, what happens if we eliminate those two sources of ulcerative colitis? Well, the problem is, if you don't eat fiber, you're going to back up with poop and explode, because everybody knows you have to have fiber for a healthy poop. Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe not. My son today is 7 days old. He's being fed breast milk. That's pure carnivore. There is zero fiber in breast milk. And let me tell you from personal experience, he poops, and he poops a lot, and it is absolutely fine. No fiber. Okay? So lions don't get constipated. My dog's a carnivore. He doesn't get constipated. So we don't need fiber. We do not need macro or micro fiber for healthy poops. Number one. So therefore, if you have ulcerative colitis, eliminate any sources of fiber, which is primarily your vegetables, your fruits, and your grains. And if grains are one of the big culprits, cut them out of your diet. You will not die of anorexia if you skip those. But make sure you're eating a decent amount of fat and a decent amount of salt, sodium chloride, and a moderate amount of water, because that's where healthy poop comes from. So if we do that, if we eliminate the fiber, and we eliminate everything that creates fiber in the human intestine, what food group is left? Animal products. Animal products. And if you can then migrate to a primarily carnivore-based diet or an omnicarnivore-based diet, you're eliminating so many of the suspicious triggers, not only the fiber, but also the subset of the biome that comes along with that fiber. And if you take a course of powerful antibiotics and maybe some antifungals at the same time, maybe some diflucan, the regimen that I use is diflucan, Ancef, ciprofloxacin, and Flagyl, metronidazole, to cleanse the gut of that biome, and then I restart you on an animal-based biome. Probiotics is just putting shit in a capsule. Who knows what guesstimates they have of what the right bacteria are, but when you eat food, there are resident bacteria in that food that represent that food, and in a carnivorous diet over a few months, you transition to that biome. So if you're eating primarily milk products, if you can tolerate them, they're fine to try. If you can't tolerate them, if they give you diarrhea, if they give you cramping, stay away. But they're not the enemy. Eggs, red meat, lots of red meat. Red meat will not kill you. There's no evidence to support the fact that red meat causes harm, despite all the beliefs in the literature. Oh, red meat causes... No, it doesn't. Eat your red meat. It's absolutely fine. Eat it with lots of salt. Eat it with butter. High fat, protein. You can eat fish. You can eat poultry, seafood. Again, if you can tolerate it. If you stick to a carnivore diet, your biome changes and you eliminate the potential triggers of fiber. The other beauty about a carnivore diet, especially if there's not a lot of tendons and gristle and bones and that kind of thing in the food that you're eating, most of it gets metabolized and absorbed in the small intestine. So there's very little residue. Your poop volume and your poop frequency goes down, and it helps you with diarrhea. Now, at first, you're going to have the shits. You're going to have awful diarrhea as your body adapts to a carnivore diet. Whether you've got ulcerative colitis or not, it doesn't matter. Everybody that goes rapidly carnivore. So do it in stages. Go slowly. Take a month or two to completely get onto a carnivore diet. Slowly adapt your intestine. But for food from a carnivorous diet, almost all of it gets processed in the stomach and the small intestine, so very little enters the colon. And you're only going to be pooping every 2 or 3 days. And if there's salt and fat in that poop, yeah, you'll have some diarrhea to begin with, but eventually that goes away. Plus, you're getting a decent amount of iron, which is going to treat some of that anemia. Plus, you're getting a ton of B12 and folate in that food if it's a well-balanced, proper carnivore diet. I hate the word balance, but a spectrumed carnivore diet. You're getting all the nutrients in. The only two things you may want to add a little bit of it is some vitamin C, maybe squirting some lemon juice on your steak, and getting some manganese in, making sure that you are getting adequate sources of manganese as a supplement in. And then you're going to have the healthiest gut. And if you eliminate those two, which you don't need to eat, fiber and the vegetable biome, you're probably getting rid of the triggering antigen. Yes, you may need to use some antibiotics and some antifungals to get rid of the biome. And I'm fine prescribing that for my UC patients. Most of them have taken those antibiotics anyway, particularly getting rid of C. diff and using flagyl or oral vancomycin to do that. But once you've done that, and you've got a good, healthy overgrowth of carnivorous bacteria, you're going to see quiescence. You're going to see a reduction in bleeding. You're going to experience a reduction in tenesmus, which is that, oh, I got to go, oh, I just went. And people with UC understand that. That's what we're looking for. So really what we're looking to do, and I think right now, a guy like Shinzo Abe, the longest running prime minister of Japan, who's just stepping down because he's 65 years old. He's had UC since he was a kid. And he probably, I don't know this, but he probably has not had his colon removed. Because the other key thing that we do with ulcerative colitis, when all those drugs, when the immunosuppressives and the salicylates and the steroids don't work, or they've got side effects, and they've got powerful side effects to powerful drugs, then we end up as surgeons as removing the colon. And yeah, that's a cure for ulcerative colitis, at least colonic ulcerative colitis. You can cure it by removing your colon, but that's a last resort, not a first resort. And certainly there are indications to do that. Toxic megacolon, massive bleeding. I've removed plenty of UC colons. And then we have to recreate the pouch. We still have to monitor the rectal cuff, or you end up with a stoma. Not a great way to live. If you can keep your colon for a long period of time, that's great. Yes, we need to monitor for cancer. But my suspicion is, and I don't have proof of this, is that the cancer is related to active disease. And if we treat the active disease and we get your colon into quiescence, your cancer risk probably goes down, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't have colonoscopic surveillance. So certainly keep that surveillance going. And hopefully you can keep your colon. So what we want to do is to limit immune overreaction. We want to banish inflammation, global inflammation, getting rid of carbohydrates, going into ketosis, more carnivorous. And we want to get rid of the activators, carbohydrates, fiber, and vegetable material with some of those vegetable antigens. And the final thing that I think will help, in fact I know because I've got a number of patients that have reported this to me, is intermittent fasting. If you can be carnivore and especially fat-adapted keto carnivore, you can quite readily get into an OMAD, 1 meal a day, which means for 23 hours a day, your colon is not seeing food residue. And therefore, you give your colon every day a protracted period of time of quiescence and of healing. So, as carnivorous as you can be, getting to OMAD, 1 meal a day, those are the two best things you can do, killing your existing biome and replacing it, not with probiotics and garbage like that, but just eating meat. Is it going to be perfect? No, but it's the best you can do right now. And I have a number of patients who are in remission of all medication and in remission of their ulcerative colitis. Is it going to happen to you? I don't know, but it's the single best thing that I can tell you to try. Good luck and let me know.